So I wanted to draw some attention to a discussion that's been going on in the comments under a video I made a few days ago about Alfred North Whitehead. Silver Soul 7 and I have been discussing the relationship between Whitehead's theology and Christian theology, and I made the comment in my video that Whitehead's God is not the Judeo-Christian God. Silver Soul 7 took offense to this, and I think an interesting discussion has emerged as a result of this. Silver Soul rightly points out that it's only because some mostly American, mostly Protestant theologians took up Whitehead's way of imagining the cosmos and God and the soul that he is in print still. Because, at least in English, I think there's a whole other French tradition that has taken Whitehead up in outside of the theological context. But in America, it was the theologians who thought Whitehead's thought was of value. And so Whitehead's theological vision must, in some sense, be compatible with Christianity, right? And I think Silver Soul actually is right to point out that it has more in comparison to Judaic theology than it does to Christian theology, in the sense that Christian theology is Greek, and it has a Platonic inheritance where, with some interpretations of Plato, the divine and the eternal are conceived of as completely separate from and above and beyond the material world of time and becoming. And for this reason, theologians like Augustine will feel shame for the fact that they have a body and seek to transcend the fallen, sinful earthly plane. And certainly Augustine, in Augustine, you can see the transition from a very Manichaean, dualistic sense of the world, of the material world as fallen and evil and dark, and of the divine spiritual world as elevated and the source of all good, whereas material is the source of all evil. And you see the transition of Augustine out of that Manichaeanism into the more Christian take, where actually there was a rescue mission from above into the fallen material world to redeem the human, at least, and eventually all of nature. But I think that Augustine doesn't fully embody this understanding of creation as saved or as full of grace, because he still felt as though he lived in sin. And Whitehead's theology, I think, is exactly, it's a post-resurrection philosophy. It's a philosophy that tries to fully embody the logic of the Logos, the logic of the incarnation of the Logos. Because for Whitehead, every moment of creation is the miracle of resurrection, where matter fades into the past and is reborn again, resurrected again in the mind of an individual incarnation, or resurrected again as the mind of an individual incarnation. So it really is, for Whitehead, it's given to experience for Whitehead that matter resurrects itself and becomes mind in each moment, over and over and over and over again, and evolves as it does so, towards beauty ultimately for Whitehead. That's his highest value, I think, is beauty, more so than goodness or truth. Though, as any good Platonist, these aren't separate ideas. Truth, beauty, and goodness are faces of the unutterable divine presence. Um, but, you know, Whitehead is a post-resurrection philosopher. I've never quite put it that way, but I think it makes sense in this context. And so you could argue that he is almost the culmination of Christian theology, or the actualization of it, in a metaphysics and a cosmology that recognizes the universe as the revelation of something divine, and the human being as a particularly complex mirror image of this process. You know, the human is capable of understanding the process of the universe. You know, that's the conceit of every metaphysician when they begin to write down their thoughts, or to teach their thoughts, or to think at all. Whitehead is trying to imagine such a world, and we can do so with him. But you know, the reason his thought is so difficult, I think, is that he's really speaking and writing in a way that offends our sense of grammar and our sense of how, you know, predicates relate to subjects, and how nouns and verbs are supposed to be arrayed in a sentence together, and how, you know, propositions change the way these positions are perceived and interpreted. And you know, he's a difficult writer, and Isabel Stenger's is no easier. She's really thinking with Whitehead, and to that extent, the thickness, the semantic thickness of her prose is takes a while to chew on before you can actually swallow it. It's very textured. It's very you know, semantically rich. But I wanted to read at least a few pages from the second to last chapter, called "God and the World," just so more of us can think with Whitehead, because it's an expensive book, and you know, it's not going to be read by many people, unfortunately. At least maybe not for a few more years, when Whitehead gets the attention he is due. You know, it's interesting. I'll get to reading in a second, but there was a debate between Einstein and Bergson in 1922 that everyone thought that Einstein won. But the debate wasn't over whether Einstein was right about relativity. It was what the role of experience is in science and in physics. And if Bergson had won, and Whitehead, of course, was very influenced by Bergson, and Whitehead also had his disagreements with Whitehead Whitehead had his disagreements with Einstein for the same reasons that Bergson did, to a large extent. But if Bergson had won this discussion, we would be living in it was perceived to have won this discussion. We would be living in a completely different world today, where I think industry and technology and science, and the sort of war between technoscience and the humanities, or between science and religion, it would be unfolding in a completely different way, such that there wouldn't be such a harsh opposition between the two. This is a technical matter, though. But I'll post a video, a link to a video in the description, where the philosopher Bruno Latour speaks about this debate between Einstein and Bergson, to give you a better sense of what the hell I'm talking about here. So I'm going to read here some Stenger's. This is on page 449, if you have the book at home. So this is a quote from Whitehead. "The final summary can only be expressed in terms of a group of antitheses whose apparent self-contradictions depend on neglect of the diverse categories of existence. In each antithesis, there is a shift of meaning which converts the opposition into a contrast." Converting oppositions into contrast is a crucially overlooked part of Whitehead's philosophical approach. And that's how he gets out of dualism. He converts oppositions into contrasts. Whitehead continues, "It is as true to say that God is permanent and the world fluent, as that the world is permanent and God is fluent. It is as true to say that God is one and the world many, as that the world is one and God many. It is as true to say that, in comparison with the world, God is actual eminently, and that, in comparison with God, the world is actual eminently. It is as true to say that the world is immanent in God, as that God is immanent in the world. It is as true to say that God transcends the world, as that the world transcends God. It is as true to say that God creates the world, as that the world creates God. God and the world are the contrasted opposites in terms of which creativity achieves its supreme task of transforming disjoined multiplicity, with its diversities in opposition, into concrescent unity, with its diversities in contrast. That from pages 347 and 348 of Process and Reality. Stengers begins, anyone might think that the philosopher who wrote these lines, 3 pages before the end of Process and Reality, is summarizing a careful argumentation in which he will have demonstrated how it is possible to affirm antithetical statements at the same time, in the mode of, it is as true. And my reader is no doubt preparing for a new flight of experience, for the new leaps of imagination that should be brought about by taking into account the categories of existence, whose neglect, Whitehead affirms, explains why the antitheses take on a contradictory character. As usual, henceforth, the circle that announces the leap seems to be there, that a series of oppositions may be transformed into so many contrasts, testifies to a cosmos, and it is the difference between cosmos and neutral creativity, or what we may as well just call chaos. It is this difference that requires Whitehead's God. So the difference between chaos on the one hand, or creativity, pure creativity, and cosmos is why Whitehead's metaphysical system requires God. The way Whitehead is going to oblige us to think of God and the world should in itself constitute a testimony to the role of God in the world. Quoting Whitehead again, there is no meaning to creativity apart from its creatures, and no meaning to God apart from the creativity and the temporal creatures, and no meaning in the temporal creatures apart from creativity and God. Process and Reality, page 225. Stengers continues, we know what to expect. We will be obliged to think of God and the world in a regime of reciprocal presupposition, affirming creativity as the ultimate. God and the actual occasions will be described in a mode that makes them both the creatures of creativity and the conditions of creativity. A new flight of speculative experience will begin. And yet, in this case, the leap of imagination did not take place. Whitehead's interpreters have remained perplexed and even appalled, and in any case, rooted to the soil of their disagreements. The divergent interpretations and hypotheses with regard to the manner of modifying, prolonging, or completing process and reality succeed one another, as if, in this case, the conceptual assemblage could not suffice, could not become a matter of sheer disclosure. In fact, the triumphalist character of Whitehead's final summary should not impress us overmuch. On November 11th, 1947, that is, a few weeks before his death, Whitehead, speaking of process and reality, fragments of which were perhaps to be re-edited, affirmed the true credo of his research to Lucian Price. Quote, in the preface to it, said he, I wrote something which ought to have been repeated in the opening sentence of the first chapter, and repeated at frequent intervals all through the book, namely, how impressed I am with the inadequacy of any human being's attempt to express such philosophical ideas at all, how utterly beyond our scope are these universal processes. All one can do, in venturing on such subjects, is to offer suggestions. Yeah, thanks for listening, and read this book, really. It's